In this clip, we're going to learn about variables. So variables are basically containers for data. A variable is typically denoted with some sort of custom name that you come up with, and that is particularly associated with the behavior or the data that it is going to be holding. So for example, let's say that we wanted to just have a variable to check if the player is alive. So what I would do is I would go into the class inside of this first curly bracket, and on the next line, just for organization purposes, I would begin to type in a couple of keywords to create my variable. Now, when you create a variable, you must define everything about that variable or the container itself. It's kind of like saying, I know that I need to ship this ball, but I need to figure out what kind of container it's going to be in. So I could use a cube-like container to put it in, but I need to have one that is big enough for this ball to fit in. How does that actually pertain to variables here? The first thing I'm going to figure out is this variable a public variable or a private variable? And typically, by default, you want to define your variables as private, meaning nothing else should have access to these variables except for this class. So I'm going to say private, and then I need to figure out what this container should actually hold. So in this case, I know that I'm going to be checking to see if the player is alive. And so the data that needs to come out of that, it either needs to be true or it needs to be false. And so I'm going to use a Boolean data type, and that is represented by the keyword bool. So we have our access modifier, we have our data type, and then now we need to give it the variable name. This name can be anything that you think of as long as it doesn't contradict any keywords used by Visual Studio. So in this case, I'm going to call this isAlive. And I typically write this out as if it's kind of a question. So that way, whenever I look at the script, I can simply look at it and say, if player is alive equals false, then I can write out the message, player is dead. So now that we have the name of the container, or the variable, we can end it two ways. We could go ahead and assign a value to the variable here by typing in the equal sign, which is an assignment operator, and then give it a value. Now, the value that you put in or you assign to this must match the data type. So a Boolean data type can only read true or false. So if I were to put a number in here saying equals 14, then it would throw an error saying, I don't understand this data type. Perhaps you meant to use an integer in this case. So what I would type in is either true or false. In our case, we're going to say true. Now, with every line of code, excluding the functions that you want to end, you are going to end it with a semicolon. In this case, we will end it with a semicolon. Now I can go ahead and hit enter just to give myself some space between my next block of code. So now that we have defined the variable, we need to make sure that we are actually using the variable. So to use a variable, we just simply need to figure out where we want to use it. So the easiest place to use it in this case would be in the start function. So here I would simply type in the name of the container or the variable, and I would say isAlive equals, and then we could say true, or actually false. Now whenever I end this with a semicolon, at the start it's simply going to assign the variable isAlive to false. So let's save this and let's test it out in Unity. Now for this to work, you need to left click and drag the script to the object that you want it to be on in your game. So in this case, it makes sense to drag it onto the player. So left click and drag and drop that, and then you can select the player and you would be able to see that. So let's scroll down in the inspector, and here you can see the player script is now assigned as a component. Now we're looking at this and it's saying the private field, player is alive, is assigned, but it is never used. It always looks outside of the start function to see if this is actually true. So the start function, it doesn't get checked. Right now, we have that variable set as private, and what I want to do is I want to be able to see it in my inspector. This is called exposing a variable. To expose a variable, you just need to go back into your script and change the access modifier of your variable. In this case, I'm going to change it from private to public. You can hit Control S to save it, and then we'll go into Unity, and in a moment you'll see that compile, and then the player script now has that variable called isAlive, and you can see by default it is checked as true. And that is all being derived from this line of code. Now whenever we hit play on the game, you'll notice that this actually switches to false. So let's hit play. Now you'll notice that isAlive is set to false, and that is being driven by the start method. Remember, the start method, whenever the game begins, it will execute whatever code is in these brackets, and that is how it set it to false. So what are some other things that we can do with variables? Variables are going to be the way that you change things in your code. Now, they are only data containers. Okay, so all we're doing in our scripts is we are changing things about these variables, and we're changing things based on what the player is choosing to do. So in this case, with our player is alive, we are always checking to see if the player is actually alive. We're checking to see if that health reaches 0, and once it does, we turn this is alive to false, meaning the player's health has depleted and we need to respawn. So there are all kinds of these interactions and changes that are going on in game development. These changes are typically done through what's called functions or methods, and we'll talk about how to create those next.